here tonight for our author event with Aundi Kolber. We're excited to have Aundi here. Thank you so much. And once again, we have her books available, both Strong Like Water and Try Softer. Those are available tonight. They're 20% off. And we'll have registers open right up until 8 o'clock. And we'd be glad for you to either have the book that you already have signed, or if you need one, to purchase that here. Boy, it's great to have you, Aundi. Aundi is a licensed therapist, and I won't get into her whole story or biography. I'd rather let her tell that. But it really strikes me, Aundi, that you're passionate about the intersection of faith and psychology, and I think that's so important. And I'm looking forward to what you have to say today. So she's gonna lay out to us what is on her heart, and after that we're going to have an opportunity for question and answer, and I think we'll enjoy that as well. And then we'll move into a more intimate and one-on-one sort of setting with a chance to meet her, to have your book signed, and we're really looking forward to hearing what God's placed on your heart tonight, Aundi.
Well, hello. This is so fun. Well, yes, I'm Aundi Kolber, and I am a walker. When I came in, there was a chair, which was wonderful, but it was a low chair. And Bart was like, how's that gonna work for you? And I was like, I have a lot of energy in my body, and so I like to walk, and that's something you'll probably notice. But I am a licensed professional counselor, and I've been doing that for about 16 years. And then I am also the author of technically 3 books, though one is a companion book. Try Softer, the Try Softer Guided Journey, and Strong Like Water. And Strong Like Water just came out about a month ago, and so kind of am still riding the waves of that intensity, but it's been so fun. I am married to Brendan, who's here tonight, and so glad that he could be here, because a lot of times he's not able to be. And then my 2 kiddos, Tia and Jude, 11 and 6. It's so good to have them here tonight too. So I have a lot of different parts of my story, but we recently moved from Colorado to Michigan this last June. And so I am, I suppose, now a Michigander. Is that correct? Is that the right way to say it? Okay. Also, I'm wondering if anyone can confirm that we are through 5th winter. Is 5th winter over? No, it's still not. Okay, fair enough. This week I was like, wow. Yeah, so, but yeah, Western Michigan is a little bit new for us, but it's really been an adventure to get to move from Colorado, which I do miss. But to be here in Michigan is also really beautiful. So a few things about me that I didn't share in that initial introduction. One is that part of my story is that I am a survivor of complex trauma from my childhood. And I share that in part because it very much does show up in my writing. It also certainly impacts my clinical work too, in the sense that it impacts the view of what I bring to my work with clients, because I've had the lived experience of being a person in their shoes, in their seat, to have to be that vulnerable with things that are profoundly difficult or scary. And also in my writing, part of why I decided to begin writing is because it's not that there weren't some great resources out there. I think there are some great resources, but I was looking for something really specific. And it was like I felt this fire in my own belly to say, what would it be like for me to channel that and sort of give myself almost work to create something that I wish that I would have had. that I wish that I would have had when I was like 20 years old, and I had no idea kind of what was going on in my body and in my experience, and didn't really have a lot of language for it. And so that is a lot of, it's sort of the viewpoint that I bring to the work that I'm doing. And so I think with that, one thing that has become really important to me, and I think it's always been important, but in many ways, as I've healed, it's gained even an increase in that importance, is the idea that, biblically, Jesus commands us to love our neighbor as ourselves. And for me, in the work that I do, part of that is really honoring myself in the work, because I believe that's how I then can have the capacity to really love those that I'm hopefully writing to, or speaking to, or talking to. And I think sometimes we sort of miss, what that might mean. And so for me, a part of that is always working to really notice that healing is reciprocal. And as I do my own work, I hope that it invites others into their own work. And as they interact with that work, honestly, it encourages me and invites me into that deeper work. And what a beautiful dance, right? That this is the way that it becomes a flow of healing. This is the way that communities change, and this is the way that things shift. And so those are some of the perspectives that I bring when I'm thinking about this. So one of the questions I get a lot is, why do you, well, first of all, what's up with your titles? Someone the other day, what did they say to me? It was in a podcast interview, and they said, who's the guy from the Karate Kid, the mentor? Mr. Miyagi. Someone said, she said, you're kind of like the Mr. Miyagi of this work. And I had to giggle. But I think what she meant by that is, like, I love when words make you stop and kind of go, wait, what did you just say? Like, wait, what does that mean? And I think that has been true, with Try Softer. That's certainly been a part of it. But Strong Like Water, which is, I'm gonna focus probably mostly on tonight. But Strong Like Water has been this interesting process of trying to figure out, like, it's been my own journey of how do I talk about strength differently. I grew up, and I'm gonna talk a little bit about my story, but I grew up really being viewed as a strong person. And so when I became an adult and was doing my own healing work, I sort of had this irritation, almost. Like when people would tell me how strong I was. Like, it kind of made me it kind of bothered me, because I internally was feeling like, gosh, I don't like that I had to be that strong. And I've seen that a lot in the clients that I work with, and in just the survivors and the community on social media. I see this theme in a lot of folks, that it can be a little bit uncomfortable. How do we talk about strength? And so I want to just go back. Some of you might have heard this story before, if you've read the book already, and if you haven't, it's a little preview. So when I think about this concept of having to be stronger than you want to be, I picture myself at 22 years old. I'm standing, well, really sitting next to the raging Pacific Ocean, and it's like there's a pretty big storm coming through, and then on the other side, I don't know if you've ever been to the Pacific Northwest, but where the Columbia River meets the Pacific Ocean, there's just water all the way around. And this was one of the only places where I felt like I could go and just sort of let myself sort of fall apart. And on this particular week, I'm 22 years old, and and I had called off an engagement to be married and quit my first professional job in a matter of a week. And also I had just graduated college. So I literally had this, like, it was like everything just sort of blew up at once. And so I had again, my whole life, this feeling of like, I have to be strong. And in many ways, that was, well, not just in many ways, it was valid that I felt that way. Because it wasn't really safe for me to ask for help. It wasn't really safe in my family to have a lot of needs. So here I am, 22 years old. And it's like I reached the end of what I would call my capacity for survival strength. It's like 22 years of literally just being everything that anybody wanted from me. Anything that, like, sort of constantly feeling like I have to tie myself into pretzels and to put myself in little tiny boxes and react immediately if someone is angry with me, like all of that energy, right? And on the outside, it maybe didn't look that way, but I was exhausted. And I was 22. Oh, bless my heart. That's 28 years ago. That is really young to be that kind of worn out, right? And so that is what I think about when I start to consider this idea of, okay, is there a different way? Is there a different way for us to be strong? And I wonder, when you hear that, how you've experienced strength. Like, what messages have you heard? Maybe you have not heard or experienced things in the same way that I have. Maybe you wouldn't necessarily identify as having experienced complex trauma. But when you're hurting, and when you're sad, and when you feel alone, and then someone says, but what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. What's that like? Right? Like, what does that do to us when we feel like, wow, so I guess I'm not getting any other support here? You know, like, it's kind of like, I guess I just keep going on, you know, like, keep that brave face, or whatever, you know, whatever version. It may not be that. And I think some of us, we maybe have even said that to other people, right? Because we have been socialized, I think, to view strength in a really specific way, really narrow. Like, often it's suppress your emotions, disconnect from your body, don't talk about how you really feel, do not complain, right? And just basically all these different versions of toughen up. And, you know, one of the things I want to say is that there are times in our lives when we don't have a choice. There are times when that's what we have to do. And for me, I would say that was very true for me growing up. That was my experience. And yet, I think because of, not only clinically, but also because of my lived experience, I think I have this, and not that I'm the only person who could have this new perspective, but a unique perspective on what we mean when we talk about strength. And so strong like water is my attempt to say, let's expand this. Because when you go to therapy, that's strong. And when you learn to feel your feelings, that's really strong. And when you make amends because you made a mistake, that's strong. And when you're present to yourself and other people, not even necessarily having to give words, that's strong. And the reason I can say it's strong is not because it's just maybe sounds good, but because literally neurobiologically, here's what we know. That when our body has the safety that it needs, that we can stay connected to our full self, and that we can ultimately metabolize, meaning our body can process and digest experiences in the way that they're meant to do. And when we're in that sort of more survival mode, it's really hard to do that. Well, I would say it's almost impossible, actually. And so I'd like to get into a little bit of sort of the nuts and bolts, not like every single detail, but a little bit what's like the practice behind, what's the framework behind Strong Like Water? Because again, I think a lot of these ideas, they can sound really good, right? But I think sometimes we need a little bit more. I kind of like to think of it like it's a map. Like I think that when we have things that feel a little bit more tangible and accessible in that way, it helps everybody, but especially I think often trauma survivors. Because I think about how disorienting it is to be in a place where your body is constantly reacting. Your body is constantly, you're acting in ways that you don't love, or you're like, wait, what was that about? And we don't always have a lot of language to be able to make sense of our experience. And so in Strong Like Water, one of the things that I introduce is something I call the flow of strength. You'll notice it sounds like water. That is not a mistake. But in the flow of strength, on one side, what I sort of imagine it to be is situational strength. And situational strength is what I mean when I say that survival strength. Meaning, neurobiologically, what's happening is that your prefrontal cortex, which we need in order to sort of access our full brain and our full body, that is offline. And when we're in that survival brain, I think what's really important to understand is that we actually have very little choice. We are coming from literally what our body perceives is needed to be able to navigate whatever threat we are experiencing. And so one thing I want to say about situational strength is that it can sound a little bit like, ooh, I don't ever want to go to situational, or I don't want to ever be in situational strength. What I think is important for us to understand is that we need situational strength. Like when I used to live in Colorado, I would go on lots of hikes. But here's the thing in Colorado, is that there's a ton of snakes. Woo, ton of snakes. And so I would be up in like these hills behind our house. And I would find myself, I'd be walking, and I mean, I had no idea I could move that quickly. like when there's a snake, like I see it out of the corner of my eye. And the ways that this works in our body is that literally before you have a conscious thought, your body is already shifting and adapting in order to help you navigate the threat. And really in a situation like this, it's like, oh my God, move, it's quick, I'm out of the way. And then what happens is that intensity that just came up in your body, when your body perceives that you're safe, it will actually, it will metabolize. And it'll take a little bit of time, but not a lot. And then you'll be like, oh yeah, this afternoon I was walking and there was a snake. And it's like, you're not necessarily traumatized by that experience. So situational strength is something that we really need. But what can happen for folks is that when you have a history of unresolved trauma, so lots of experiences that are too big for your nervous system to be able to fully process and metabolize, what can happen is that we might end up spending more time in that situational strength than we mean to or we want to, because our body is on high alert for danger. And that can be a really difficult way to live, because it's pretty unsustainable to our bodies to always live in situational strength. Because what it requires from us is pretty immense, which is why it's sort of like it's like an e-brake, you know? Like, you don't want to use that unless you need it. But if you need it, then you need it. And that's kind of how that works. But as our body has enough safety, we can move into what I call transitional strength. And transitional strength is when, a couple things are happening. The first is that prefrontal cortex is beginning to come back online. And as it comes back online, what that means is we can observe in our bodies what's happening. Meaning, let's say somebody made you really irritated, you're really irritated at someone, right? But you have enough, maybe it's internal, external, multiple types of sort of support or safety, that you can sort of notice that you're angry or irritated, but you're not necessarily losing it. You're able to be what might be helpful is going on a walk right now, and you have some awareness, and you're able to, I think of it you're working with yourself. And so this is a place where, honestly, this is where a lot of magic happens. If you've read Try Softer, I would say a lot of Try Softer is happening in the transitional strength space. It's learning to cultivate compassionate attention for our bodies, our systems, our stories, everything that we've carried. And again, if you're a trauma survivor, there may be a lot, which is why we really want to cultivate that ability to do that. Because, it's one thing I say often is the more complicated the trauma, the more complex the healing. And there's no shame in that. I think that this is a really normal thing, that would be true. But we need to be able, it's almost like that's how we access the work. And so as our body has, again, enough safety, we continue to be able to metabolize and connect to our resources and do what we need to do to be fully human. And what begins to happen is that we move towards what I would call integrated strength. And that integrated strength is essentially almost like what happens when, again, if you go back to that short example of the snake, it's I could be in situational, oh, I'm safe now, everything's gonna be okay. And it's over and I'm home and, phew, that was weird, right? That's a picture of how fast it can move. It can move that quickly. And we might even have multiple experiences like that a day. And that's okay, that's really normal to some extent. And for many folks, they may end up spending more time, again, if you have more of a history of unresolved trauma, going from situational to transitional, situational to transitional, because, again, as our body is having to be on higher alert, that's what can happen. And so I am just a huge proponent for offering ourselves and others, as we're able, just a ton of compassion and dignity in this process. Because, so maybe even I'm wondering, maybe this is your own internal self-check. As you hear this, you might be thinking, oh, here's the checklist. Okay, I gotta, this is how I gotta get this done, or oh, there was 2 in transitional, there was 1 in integrated, and I got 3, it's we have all these ways we score ourselves, when am I gonna be good enough? When will I be good enough? And what I just want you to hear, as much as you're able to receive this, is that this is not that. This is not that. This is not about a finish line. This is not oh gosh, now that you've been able to do that, now you matter, now you have value. Instead, I hope that it will help us to reframe, if I'm spending a lot of time in situational strength, it's a cue that my body is not experiencing enough safety. That's what I want you to take away. And if you're in transitional, beautiful, that's great. What that means is that maybe you need continued support and or curiosity and compassion as you figure out what you need to allow your body to be able to continue to process, to get over into integrated strength when you're able. But again, this is a flow. This is a flow. This is not about being rigid. This is not about being stagnant. And I think one other thing I'll just say about the flow of strength is, and I honestly love this metaphor because I love water. But I think of a lot of this almost like situational strength is like ice, right? Ice is really powerful. Like if you drop a huge thing of ice on like a car, it's gonna make a dent, you know? Or like if you're in a boat and you're going down and you hit an iceberg, like that's gonna make a dent, right? So it's not that it's not strong. It's so strong. Here's what it is though. It's very rigid. It doesn't change. It has one note. And that's what situational strength is like. It's got one note. It's gonna keep you alive. And that's great. But we don't wanna have to always just survive, right? We don't always wanna just have to survive. And just like water, or just like H2O can change states, so can we. And I believe that God designed our bodies with the capacity for that fullness of who we are. That we don't have to leave, like, for an example from my own life, I think about some of the things that I gained from my life experience. Some of those things I learned because I had to. And as I've healed, what I have, and not that I'm finished healing, but in my journey of healing, there have been times where it's like I've almost been afraid of my own, sometimes it's been fire, my own tenacity, things like that, things that helped me survive. And here's what's so beautiful about this work, is that as we do that deep work of healing, our body is able to process and metabolize what is sort of not needed, meaning the parts that have traumatic energy, our bodies can learn to discharge that and leave it. But the gold in your story, the things that are part of who you are, the ways that you are proud of surviving, those are yours. Those are yours. And you don't have to leave them in your survival. But now one of the things that can happen is that instead of having to do those things or be those things only just to survive, that they could be available to you from a place of wholeness, that they can be in service of like your wholeness, your becoming more yourself. Like that is how those things can shift over time. And so I just think that's I hope that encourages you as you think about how strength can look different. And I think that it's just a really hopeful process. And so one of the things that I mentioned that helps us move along the flow of strength is, I mentioned safety. So I want to talk about that for just a moment, because safety and resourcing, one of the things I talk about in the book is something called compassionate resourcing. And I'd like to tie these two things together because Dr. Ariel Schwartz is a psychologist. I love her work, and she says that a resource is anything that communicates safety to your body in the present moment. And when we think about this framework, part of what I think a lot of people are missing is they're like, okay, this sounds great. Like, awesome, I don't want to live from the survival energy anymore. I don't want to do that. Okay, so what do I do, right? And where do I start? And this is where I think that the concept of learning to really develop and cultivate more resourcing in your life can be profoundly helpful. And this is something you can do in therapy, but in many ways, and part of what honestly I geeked out about as I was writing this book, is I was like, I want people to know about resourcing, because this is something that I think is one of the most underused tools right now in mental health, is that a lot of folks get into therapy and they're like, wow, my life is falling apart. And that's valid. But what can be hard about that is that when we don't have the stabilization and safety before we go into that deep work, it can get us more stuck. Because again, we cannot bypass our bodies. Our bodies need to have a certain level of that safety and stabilization to do that deeper work. And so I wanted to actually just read a little part of Strong Like Water that talks about something actually called glimmers. Has anybody heard the term glimmers? Okay, awesome. Just a second. Therapist Deb Dana coined the term glimmer to refer to experiences, sensations, or micro moments that cue safety, calm, or regulation in our nervous system. In every respect, a glimmer is the opposite of what is often called a trigger. If a trigger is anything, smell, taste, experience, person, etc., that activates an embodied memory of a past threat or trauma, a glimmer is something that helps us connect with a sense of our felt safety and step back into our window of tolerance, or in polyvagal theory, our ventral vagal system. I love the language of glimmer because it literally speaks to lighting up a vital part of ourselves that makes us human. Tuning into glimmers essentially makes us feel connected, curious, creative, compassionate, alive, and more. Just about anything that lights up our ventral vagal can be a resource. Though the lake at Kolber Cottage has become quite special to me, I've come to recognize that this is the place of about 1 million glimmers of goodness for Brendan. For Iris, having a reparative experience with her boss is now a significant glimmer for her. Occasionally, in the middle of an already harried day, I will receive a text from my dear friend Ashley, who lives on the other side of the country. Basically, she says something like this: "I have a ventral balm for you." This is a true story. And then she'll be like, "Check this out." And she will have sent me some sort of animal meme, a ridiculous GIF, or maybe even a parenting TikTok video. Inevitably, I will giggle pretty hard and confirm that she was right. She provided a ventral balm that helped me tap into my true self. After seeing it, I feel lighter, my cheeks are a tiny bit red, and my heart feels much more open. As we think about glimmers and resourcing, I invite you to consider this verse from Philippians 4:8. Finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, whatever is noble, whatever is right, whatever is pure, whatever is lovely, whatever is admirable, if anything is excellent or praiseworthy, think about such things. This verse is a powerful example of modeling both glimmers and resourcing for believers. It's vital we remember that we have a God who can hold and honor both our lament and our joy. We don't and shouldn't shame uncomfortable emotions like sadness, anger, despair, and confusion. We know we have a God who asks us to weep with those who weep. But as we look at the Philippians passage, we see that we are also invited to honor and cultivate emotions that bring us comfort. They're just as important. This verse itself offers a resource of what it might look like to allow our brains to be shaped by goodness, built on the ultimate resource, God with us. Certainly, and this is an important disclaimer, for trauma survivors, goodness has at times been so fleeting and unavailable that initially our bodies may feel triggered or unable to fully savor something comforting. Without proper pacing of our nervous system, it may even feel overwhelming at first. But just like all of our work, we can trust that God gave our bodies wisdom to help us know how to begin learning to experience these moments at the pace we are able. All glimmers and resources are reminders of the witness and witness of God. My friend and fellow therapist, Dr. Allison Cook, compares the ideas of glimmers to hope, not only in everyday life, but also as it's demonstrated in the Bible. I happen to agree with her that whether goodness comes through common or specific grace, it is a form of tangible hope. And as the Apostle Paul writes in Romans 5:3, we can glory in, not because of, our suffering, knowing that because God is with us, God can cause even those things that have harmed us to develop our endurance, character, and hope. And here's possibly my favorite part. This hope does not put us to shame. So what I hope you hear as I read that is that this is different. This is different than saying to someone, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, you know? And that it's not to say that there aren't times when, again, that we have to survive. It's not that there aren't times that our body is adapting and having to just do the best we can. But, you know, as the sign is from the book, and it's one of my favorite lines, and it's that love changes us in ways that fear and danger simply cannot. And that is so powerful to me, because certainly, if there's anything that's true, I think it's that I am a huge proponent for honoring the ways our bodies are made, honoring our pacing, giving dignity and offering dignity to all parts of ourselves, especially wounded ones. And I think one of my deep hopes at this time in our world, this time in our culture, this time in the church, is that we come back. That we come back, right? Like that creates something in us that is more firm and more solid and more hopeful and more resourced than anything that fear can do. And so I think, you know, as we're going to transition in just a minute to the Q&A, but I would love to just read the benediction from the end of the book, just because I would love to do that. My dear listeners, thank you for engaging and joining me in the fierce and tender work of becoming strong like water. I pray this book will meet you, support you in places of hurt, and feel like a balm toward the parts of you that are aching for care. As you continue, may you internalize in your very flesh and bones the kind gaze of the incarnational God who fashioned you, loves you, and calls you beloved. May you find safety in places you never dreamed, and compassion in the unlikeliest of connections. May every moment of goodness you experience begin to create a reservoir of hope in your body from which you can draw whenever you need. May each of your senses be attuned to glimmers of beauty and healing whenever they are available. And when pain and difficulty come, because they will, may you have the courage and tenacity to honor them while also accessing the compassionate resources that are available to you now. In those times when you worry about being both too much and not enough, I hope you'll remember that just as your softness is a gift, so is your fire. Reader, may you know in the depths of yourself that healing is always, always sacred work. Nothing you do to turn with compassion toward yourself or another will go to waste, because healing is worth the risk and the work. And finally, my deepest prayer is that you will experience the witness and nearness of God, in whom all things are held together. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for sharing that with us, Aundi. And now we're going to move to the question and answer portion. And I hope that just some things have come to mind that you died to ask at this point. And if that's the case, you just raise up your hand and I'll run right over to you, give you the microphone, and you can ask your question. If I missed you, don't fear. I will get to you eventually. And we'd love to start right now. Does anyone have a thought? All right.
I don't know that I need a mic though.
Oh, okay. If you
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yep.
First of all, your words just like tear me up because they're just so beautiful, so tender. And with that, I've been doing a lot of healing work in a family that isn't, no one else is. And so I can very much look like an outlier. And I feel like, and I heard this referenced in a podcast with you, that this healing work can be perceived as like very selfish and like you're too focused on yourself instead of what that's doing to heal, other. And so that's always very difficult, as well as having been through a lot of difficult situations, and I will call them traumatic. And again, I know that it was traumatic for me. And it will appear to be too traumatic or too, and so healing can be very lovely work.
Yeah, thank you for sharing what you did, and just I'm with you this is tender work, and I just want to honor what you're saying. I think it can be really lovely, and I think it's good to acknowledge that. I talk about that pretty frequently. I see that a lot in clinical work for folks who are choosing to engage healing. Oftentimes systems exist, right? And you've played a role in that system. And when you say, okay, you know what, like something's not like, for whatever that buy-in for you is, like maybe you don't like having to tie yourself into pretzels. Maybe you feel like you're not living in alignment with who God made you to be. Like there are so many reasons we begin that work, but something in us is like, this isn't good, this isn't right. And we get in and we start doing that healing. And what can be really confusing for people is a sense that instead of supporting you, well, maybe the people a lot of times might be supportive at first, but what you may find is that people kind of start to get frustrated because when you begin to use your voice, or when you begin to, maybe try to set boundaries, things like that, that disrupts the system. And that can be hard. And it's not to say, I will say, like, it's really normal also when you're engaging healing work. Like, if you barely ever set boundaries in your life and you're just starting to, like, there's gonna be some missteps. You're gonna be like, I was a little too rigid here. I was way not, like, firm enough here. Like, there's all these versions, and there's lots of grace for that, and there's lots of room to grow. And obviously, we always have to be mindful of how we maybe have caused harm or hurt others too in that process. But I think mostly I just want to affirm that, I think there's different levels of that loneliness. And so for some folks, it gets to the point where, in really extreme examples, where you're not able to really spend a lot of time in that system. And sometimes with good boundaries and, continued working on communication, that then allows you to have connection with that system, but then needing other places where you're seen as who you really are. And I just can't overstate, that just goes so much with that flow of strength, how much we need those places where we are seen and known. Thank you for sharing.
Right, and any others tonight? All right, excellent, right here.
I'm curious where you found the initial courage and strength to put any of this on paper.
Great question. So writing has been such an interesting journey. Like, I never was a person who was like, someday I'm gonna write a book. Like, that was not, I know for a lot of authors, like, they kind of always knew that was not me. But I have always loved writing, and I've always loved books. Like, books for me, I would say, have been a resource. They were a place that I could go into, almost at times probably lose myself, when when things were really bad, you know? So that's kind of been my background. And then when my daughter Tia was about 2, I was working a little bit in private practice and then at home a decent amount. And I had just this weird, like, internal feeling like I needed to write. It was just very strong. But I think I was starting, you know, I was reading like Sarah Bessey, and I would read like Ann Voskamp's blog, and I was like, that's so cool. Like, I loved it. I feel like it was when blogging started to kind of get its, you know, really get some energy. And I was inspired seeing other people talk about some of their experience, but I was terrified. So what I did is that I took the entire month of November in 2014, and I wrote every day in a Word document to prove to myself that I could do it. Like, that I could write a blog, not a book. This was just a blog. And I didn't share anything. I just didn't even know if I could do it. And so after I did that for about a month, I was like, okay, I guess I could maybe do this. So that's sort of what the on-ramp was it was like incremental, and then I started blogging. My first blog was called Bravely Imperfect. And that was just a fun experiment. I feel like it was before, I feel like it's become a little more mainstream for therapists to write now. But this was back in 2015, and it was, I mean, which is not that long ago, but it was not very common. Like, it was hard to find a place online where I could use my voice in the way that felt true to how I probably write now. It took me a little while to figure out, like, how do I share the fact that I'm a therapist and I have some expertise, but also have stories that are important to me and would like to share. So it's been quite the journey.
Well, first off, I want to personally welcome you and your family to Pure, Michigan. I just really love living here, and I hope that that's the kind of experience that you have as well. I also want to thank you for these resources because they are so incredibly practical. And for the masses who can't afford therapy, what you've provided, what you've created, and what you're sharing is just a beautiful gift. So I thank you for that. And then in your books, you talk about, you encourage your readers who will need more than the resources of books. Sometimes they will need to connect with a therapist. But therapists are kind of like, everybody, teachers, doctors, whatever, like, they're all over the place. So could you maybe give us an idea of, for those who need to take that step, who can take that step, like, how do you connect with a therapist who is really doing this kind of holistic work?
Yeah, well, thank you for that. And I think that's such a valid question. I mean, I think it is hard to find a good therapist. I mean, and I say this as a therapist, like, it's hard to find a good therapist. And part of it is that not every therapist is for every client. And that, I think there's something to that too. But if I, when I am encouraging someone to find someone specific for this kind of work, there are a couple things that I always say. The first is I would encourage you to find someone who, if you can, comes from lenses like EMDR can be really good, internal family systems, IFS, also somatic experiencing. And then sometimes, and this is what's a little bit tricky because the term trauma-informed there's a lot of different meanings for trauma-informed. But if someone really, if you've read Trisofter and if they can talk about some of those elements, then they probably have some understanding. You're looking for someone who recognizes the impact of the nervous system, can help you make sure that you are connecting with your window of tolerance, So what I would say is a lot of times I encourage folks to use Psychology Today because they have filters, which I really like that because then you could be click IFS, click EMDR, click somatic experiencing, click if you want to see if they can integrate faith. I like the fact that you can search for all those filters through that. But what I would then encourage you to do is to actually have, if they're willing to do a consultation with them, do a 20-minute. And what I say is try to find 3 therapists and see if they will set up 3 consultations, and then ask, if you can, ask questions hey, this is kind of what I would like to work through in therapy. How do you typically handle that kind of work in therapy? What is your perspective on how we would handle that? And a lot of times, this is where, I also put a lot of stock into how did you feel after you spoke to the therapist? You don't need to feel like we're best friends. Obviously you're not going to be best friends, but you don't need to feel like, oh my gosh, they know everything about me. But you probably want to feel, I would encourage you to look for the sense okay, I could see this being a person that I could open up to. I could see their temperament being something that that we can build up to trust. Because just like any relationship, a therapeutic relationship requires trust, and you don't, and that's so normal. And particularly if you have a history of attachment trauma, that type of wounding, I mean, that's going to also, that's super valid. And also you want someone who can really help you attend to that. And so just listening to your own experience after you've done those consultations, I hope will give you more insight.
Right here.
Okay, I'm not quite sure how to put this into words, but you mentioned something about when you metabolize pain and you're able to discharge the pain, there's something that remains that is yours forever that you get to keep. Could you elaborate on that a little bit more and what you mean by that?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so what I want to say is that I think there's a lot of nuance, right? And I want to be really careful to, I don't want this to be another version of silver lining, because I think that happens a lot for people. But what I would say is that I have seen in so many folks, and I would say this has been true in my experience, where if you've been through really hard things, and as you heal, or as you start to heal, you may have this feeling of, because of that maybe characteristic that you developed in the midst of something traumatic, because you developed it in the trauma, it can feel like you don't ever want to connect to that characteristic in yourself. Even though the characteristic might be something really beautiful. And so what I think of this as is it's we're unlatching the trauma from the thing that is legitimately yours. One thing I say sometimes is I do not thank trauma for being strong. I am pretty adamant about that. I'm good. I do not need to be, I'm not grateful for my trauma. But what I am grateful for is that my body could adapt. I'm grateful that God made us with bodies that are able to survive. I'm grateful that there are ways that we can, at times, bring what we've learned with us. And so I think what I would just say is that a lot of what I believe is possible is that as we heal, the traumatic energy almost like sloughs off. Like that's like the language of it, it's like we're completing a cycle that didn't get to complete. Because that's what happens in trauma, is that your body goes into that sort of, whether it's a situational strength or you're like in a fight or flight response, what happens is that the energy's trapped. So when the energy itself gets to move through your body the way other experiences do, we then are left with what's really there. And often what's really there is like things like, man, I was really brave. Or like, wow, like I can't believe that I did that or that I completed that, or things that we when the trauma is still all wrapped up. I think of it like it's almost like it's got its little hands over it. You can't see the goodness because of that. And so once that's gone, you're like, oh wow, look, what was there. So I hope that helps a little bit.
I just first want to say thank you for just being you, and for the work that you do. It's just such a blessing to so many people, like everybody else has referenced. You're just a gift. And I was so excited to hear on Andy Downs' podcast that you moved to Grand Rapids, so we're lucky to have you and excited to have you here. But I just wanted to ask you too, what it looked like for you practically in your life as you moved through the flow of strength from situational to transitional was the next one, and then integrated, and what that looked like for you. And then kind of a part B to that question is, what did it look like for you to set boundaries with people in your life and your family during that time? Not even just specific that time, just your journey.
Yeah, thank you for that, and thanks for your patience. Saw your hand.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, here's what I'll say is that, I still go to situational strength at times, right? I still, I lost my dad it's been about 7 weeks. And he was a really abusive person. And a lot of my story is wrapped up in him, And so I share that to just acknowledge, maybe that frees somebody up to hear, like I'm up here talking about this, and like, oh yeah, no, I go there at times. What I would say is different is that I think I move more quickly because I have built, I think of it like a platform of safety. Like it's not just one resource, it's not just one person. It's like there are a plethora of things that I need in order to, it's almost like nourishing, right? Like I think of when you've grown up with a lot of unresolved trauma, or maybe not just grown up, but you've just existed, maybe it happened after childhood, what happens is that our whole body gets shaped around threat. And what happens when that to us is that we don't have the capacity to really bring in goodness when we're organized around threat. And that is like, it starves us in a way, because we need goodness, we need safety. And so all that to say, I think for me, that's something that still happens, but I would say what's encouraging for me is really I would say when I moved to Denver when I was 22. And that began a huge shift in my own healing work. And I think a part of it was that I had some really significant space from my family of origin. And even though there was a lot going on, in many ways my family was imploding, but I'm also really grateful that I had that space. Because I think that, along with, I think my relationship with my husband, Brendan, has been hugely impactful, but there are also just a couple people, like a mentor, a therapist, a couple of folks that consistently provided some safety, and that I noticed more and more frequently, I could come back to sort of, I kind of say it like coming back to myself is how I think of it. And then I would just say, honestly, it has been in the last probably like 6 or 7 years that I have really experienced integrated strength more fully. I write about it in Strong Like Water a bit, but I kind of talk about it when I get to integrated strength. I always am like, this is a miracle. Like I'll say that to Brendan sometimes. Like when I have moved, like if I've had something that I sort of had to move through, and I get all the way here, I'm like, you're not gonna believe this. But it happened again, you know? And it's like almost every time there's something about this that it's like, you know, Wendell Berry talks about like practice resurrection, and it feels like resurrection. And I'm like, the world is the world, like it's beautiful, it's there, you know? And it's like, it's not that I live there all the time, but I think as we have those moments, it's like an upward cycle. And it's almost like it resources the moments of the survival. Because more and more, I think our bodies learn like, okay, we're gonna come back. We're leaving, but we're coming back. And hopefully the times that it takes us, you know, it's gonna be shorter and shorter. And so it's certainly something of it's like a both and. It's been very much a process in the last, you know, couple decades of more and more quickly moving through. And then your second question was about boundaries. And holy moly, yeah, boundaries. What a need in our healing work. Boundaries, I think, you know, for me, the primary boundary that was the hardest to set was with my dad. And that was because he essentially, we had an intervention for him. And he blamed his kiddos for some really not okay behavior. And he began to send really abusive letters and send like really painful, like things that were just so hard. And so the types of, those boundaries were like, for a while, I didn't check the mail. I had Brendan check the mail for a couple of years because I lit like, and I mean not that everybody's situation is the same, but like that's how firm it was. Like I had to figure out how do I maintain a sense of safety even here, you know. That's like a more extreme version. But I think with other family members, I think learning to hold on to some compassion. I think I started out like a little more rigid as I was beginning to heal. I was like, everybody get away, you know? But then I had to be like, okay, well, that's too far. That's like swinging too far. And so holding on to their humanity, even while I'm like, hey, I'm feeling uncomfortable with this, you know, and practicing using my voice. And I think that's something that we get better and better at, but it's definitely, just absolutely essential in our healing work.
And I think we got that one right here. You?
So I just want to thank you for Trisofter. I'm a therapist and a spiritual director, so I kind of call myself a Trisofter evangelist because I use it with a lot of my female clients. And I love how you kind of integrated not just accessible counseling techniques and terminology in everyday language, but you incorporated walking with God, like integrating that faith and knowing our identity as the beloved of God, because that is so key, I think, to the healing process. So thank you for that. And so I have been learning more about CPTSD. And so I'm curious, it's not considered a diagnosis in the DSM, and yet it really makes a lot of sense. Like it should be in there. So I'm curious what you think are like the best treatments for CPTSD, because it's not something that is agreed upon.
Yeah, no, well, thanks for what you said. And yeah, I think, gosh, there is a lot to that, you know. I think I think as we understand more and more about trauma and the nervous system, and even just the understanding that so much of something that's traumatic, certainly what happens matters, but how we experience what happens really matters, right? And so I think that, frankly, like, the therapy world has catching up to do. I mean, and for me, it's not to say that there's not any value to diagnosis. I think sometimes that can be helpful for people. It can be impactful for them to have a name for what they're experiencing. It's not so much like, oh, we just get rid of that. But I would just say it's behind. The DSM is behind. And I think that the thing is, and I think this is part of my desire in writing the books that I did, is to say, certainly I don't have the same experience as every person who's been a trauma survivor, but as a trauma survivor, I wanted to center trauma survivors in my books, hoping that other people who are not will also benefit, because I think everyone benefits when we are given things like choices and encouraged to listen to our bodies and asking for consent and being aware of how our nervous system impacts us. And so I think what I would say is, obviously I think to the treatment, I'm like, well, a lot of it's like what I write about, but I think it has to be dynamic and holistic, because this work is recognizing, like, we each are like a fingerprint. Like, you have your own unique fingerprint, and then within that, you've had your own experiences, which is why the work of learning to first, in therapy, having someone attune to you, and then also learning to attune to yourself, we begin to have the capacity to say, like, here's what I need. Here's where I think we should go. And so some of the modalities that I named from the earlier answer, I think, have the capacity to be flexible. Like, I think parts work through, like, IFS can be so helpful, EMDR, body-centered work, things that help increase embodiment. Certainly I think, integrating faith can be really helpful and a beautiful piece. And, one of the things I write about even more in Strong Like Water too is just recognizing that I hope and want faith to be a resource for people. And I acknowledge and honor that faith has been weaponized again for a lot of people. And so even in that, empowering people to listen to their bodies and to say, okay, if I believe God's posture is kind, then that means if that doesn't feel safe right now, then I can pace myself, because that doesn't change, And so I guess to bring that all together, I think it has to be dynamic, and it has to be honoring the person themselves and who is sitting in front of the chair, in front of you, versus here's the checklist that someone who's never met you thinks is necessary for healing.
Just for us lay people, what is CPTSD?
Complex post-traumatic stress disorder. Yes. So a lot of times, like, that's what is, when it's a lot of times when you've experienced lots of unresolved trauma that is, indicative of often like childhood trauma, or having been trapped, or repeated types of abuse, repeated types of experiences that have not found resolve. So it's usually connected to something.
Thank you for asking that.
Yes.
I wondered as well.
Sorry about that.
And well, what a great discussion tonight, and I'm so happy that you all came out. I'd like to kind of bring this part of the event to a close, and